MTN Media Innovation Fellows discussed Pan-Africanism with Stephen Gross at South African Institute for International Affairs. At the meeting, participants addressed the challenges in the bilateral relations between South Africa and Nigeria, exploring solutions to these issues. The conversation also delved into the xenophobic attacks in South Africa, which have been fueled by economic challenges and misinformation. It was noted that the love-hate relationship between the two nations persists due to the insufficient efforts by both governments to address the underlying problems. Stephen Gross states that acknowledging the existence of the problems mostly solves it.
It's taken a long time for the South African government to recognize and accept that xenophobia is a problem. I mean, I work on the African peer review mechanism, and it was the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the mechanism, and President Thabo Mbeki was at the event, and I asked a very pertinent question. I said, when the peer review mechanism examined South Africa in 2007, it identified latent xenophobia and said this is a phenomenon that must be nipped in the bud and must be taken seriously. Mr. President, do you wish that if you went back all those years, you would have taken it a little bit more seriously? And he said, I'm not going to answer your question. And then he proceeded to answer my question for an hour. But he said, you know, a lot of it is just criminals taking advantage of this, and it's not really a problem. And the Zambian ambassador stood up and said, Mr. President, with respect, and you know when somebody says, with respect, what's coming next? He said, you know, my nationals are really suffering here. There have been people killed. There have been businesses destroyed. There have been homes destroyed. So I think it's taken a long time for the government to actually acknowledge it's a problem.
Several members of the media innovators who participated in the discussion shared their experiences and proposed solutions to the challenges.
Even though the lectures we got today was not inspiring, it was depressing for me because Africa has a myriad of challenges and problems. Fighting each other shouldn't be one of those problems, for me personally. But I also went away with the fact that the role of the media in bridging this gap cannot be understated. So for us as the media in Nigeria, I have been challenged to make sure I partner other African journalists to tell the right narratives about Africa for Africa to the globe.
And so from the conversations we had today, I'll say that one of our biggest problems is perception of what individuals, citizens of both countries think about one another. So the narration in Nigeria is that South Africans hate Nigerians, and the narration in South Africa is that Nigerians are mostly criminals fighting for their already scarce resources. But this is not entirely true. You know, South Africans do not hate Nigerians, and Nigerians are not all criminals who have the intention to, you know, deplete the already scarce resources here in South Africa. So it is perception. And because of this perception, the second problem is what we give voice to. You know, so if we keep feeding this narrative, if we keep keying into people's perception of both countries, we are not going to solve this problem. So how do we solve the problem? Let's amplify the good things about both countries. Let's amplify the best of both worlds.
But what I saw today is that South Africans are sort of giving up hope that nothing can be done, while Nigerians are really coming out to know, to see that there's something that can be done for this relationship to be very cordial. Over time, we have been brothers, we have been our neighbors, and we have always kept, you know, our back. But recently, because of the xenophobic issue, you just find out that South Africans are just like nothing can be done any longer. The government is not doing anything. The institutions that are supposed to do something are looking helpless. But today, the narratives, the discussions, the ideas, you know, that we profile has given them hope that something can be done. That is what this kind of relationships and this kind of forum, this is what it brings about. You can see that after the discussion at the beginning, they were thinking that there's nothing that can be done, or nothing can be done you know, easily to get this thing done. But Nigerians here continue to tell them the areas that they can, you know, foster this alliance, and then things will begin. By the time they begin to see reason, you see they came up immediately to the party.
A lot to take away actually, and one of the things that stood out for me is the fact that we need to push out more positive stories of international relations, right? I mean, a lot of things are happening which are on the negative side, but there are positive stories that can be pushed out. And that was one thing that stood out for me, amongst other things.
I think one of the major issues that I noticed during the conversations that we had was the proliferation of disinformation or misinformation in different parts of between both nations, in South Africa and in Nigeria. Unfortunately, I think some, elements are letting this fester.
Media practitioners have a lot to do, especially when it comes to practicing true Pan-Africanism and, of course, showcasing the good of Africa. We all have the mandate to go out there to ensure that we continue to tell the story, the good story, instead of focusing on the negative story. Because if you go on social media today, everywhere you turn to is always like, oh, South Africa is against Nigeria, Nigeria is against South Africa. But the reality is that is not it, at least from the conversation we've had today. My major takeaway from today is, as a broadcast journalist and a development advocate, it is my job to go out there to continue to focus on the good story.
This gathering has provided an opportunity for us as professionals, as lovers of Nigeria and South Africa, to reflect on some of the problems we're having and along the bilateral relationship direction. And one of the problems which we've identified is xenophobia, which, of course, according to the speaker, it has happened 3 times in 2008, 2014 and 2019. And this xenophobia is a kind of hostility towards foreigners, especially people from other African countries, as we're having it in South Africa here. But despite the fact that this has been projected as an issue, as a challenge, we're having straining the bilateral relationship between Nigeria and South Africa. It is very, very important we look into the direction of solution. And the solution is political willingness. This starts from the leaders of 2 countries.
It's been an interesting day, a day that we got to understand the nexus in terms of relationship between Nigeria and South Africa, and more importantly, the role collaboration has to play in addressing some issues that a lot of people who don't have that historical backing, have actually caused. But more importantly is the fact that as Africa, we need Nigeria and South Africa to work.
I always talk about xenophobia, the xenophobic attacks on Nigerians. And from our conversation, I found out that it could be that there are some people benefiting from this, right? And it doesn't really speak well because it's sort of selfish. A situation where people could just create something that does not exist so that there will be problems. So as Africans, I really think that Nigerians and South Africans can actually work together because these 2 countries are amazing, right? I've been in South Africa for a couple of days right now, and I'm impressed. I'm wowed at the ambience, at the beauty of the country. So I really believe that if we work together, if we look at the positive sides of both countries, it's really going to help us, and we stop wasting time on things that separate us.
Kachi Okeke, a Nigerian who has spent most of his life in South Africa, pointed out that many negative narratives have persisted due to poor perceptions that have lingered over time.
Okay, I think just the major issues fueling the narrative around the xenophobic tensions in South Africa and between South Africa and Nigeria are really just boiling down to perceptions. It's strictly a perception issue, and perceptions are driven and drawn by narratives. And these narratives need to be corrected, they need to be fact-checked, and they also need to be very much, authenticated. If at all, the best way to address this is just as journalists or as people in media to just try and understand that these perceptions are coming from very simple notions, and the best way to stop this perception is by providing an equally truthful and simple notion to adjust it. And the best way to do that as media people is just trying your best to look for the real stories, the true stories, and the ones that actually paint a very good light of the relationship between South Africa and Nigeria. And then also from this discourse, I can understand just generally the perception is quite deep. The perception is rife and is really being fueled by disinformation, misinformation in different internet sources.
Fellows at the events were encouraged to use their platforms to promote peaceful coexistence between the two countries, de-escalate tensions and focus on the commonalities that unite the two nations.
I think we managed to surface some of the controversial issues in the very complex relationship between South Africans and Nigerians, but very much I was left with the impression that there's much more that unites us than divides us, and that there's great potential. And when the two countries work together, when there's warm relations, when there's chemistry between leaders, we can take the continent with us and we can do good things for Africa. There are problems, there are tensions, but I think the will is to find the good stories, to find the positive stories, to build on that and really strengthen the relations between South Africa and Nigeria.
Discussions at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg highlighted issues in South Africa-Nigeria relations, especially xenophobia driven by economic and social challenges. MTN Innovation Fellows aim to shift the narrative towards unity by fostering dialogue and shared values, hoping to improve bilateral ties.